So this is going to be my 5th nootropic review. I haven't made one of these for a long time. And today I'll be reviewing the stimulant drug dextroamphetamine, which also likely has some nootropic effects. And so this is a pharmaceutical drug which is prescribed for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and interestingly dexamphetamine is also a street drug. It was the original speed of like the 1970s and stuff. Now its N-methyl homolog methamphetamine seems to be a lot more popular, but the street stuff's a little bit different pharmacology. Yes, in terms of its pharmacology, yes, it's the racemic one, whereas this is purely the dextrorotary one. Now going back to its prescription use, this is widely prescribed in the United States under the brand name Dexedrine. It's also well known as a mixture with some levorotary amphetamine under the brand name Adderall. So I've been taking dexamphetamine for a couple of months until switching over to methylphenidate under the brand name Concerta. But then I found that had brought some side effects, some sort of agitation, nervousness. I found that its duration was a bit off. It was a bit here and there. It wasn't consistent. So I decided to make the change to dexamphetamine. Now, in terms of the actual subjective effects of dexamphetamine and how it actually rates as a prescription medicine, it's quite an interesting substance. It compares quite differently with methylphenidate in terms of its effects. The effects of dexamphetamine are often quite subtle. Initially it produces the usual effects you'd get from amphetamine, like sort of euphoria, talkativeness, alertness, but over time these effects diminish quite considerably, and you almost get a sense as though the drug isn't working. Despite the actual lack of sort of subjective effects, it still actually provides quite consistent sort of treatment for attention deficit disorder by allowing for selective attention and also allowing for decreased impulsivity. There are some problems though with dexamphetamine. However, methylphenidate likely shares these problems, and a lot of it's got to do with dosage. Is that, as with stimulants in general, the problem is that at high dosages a person can become introverted and has difficulty switching from tasks to tasks. Now, I actually found this to be a particular issue on dexamphetamine back when I was taking approximately 30 milligrams a day, which is 6 pills of this. But now that the dosage has actually, and this was a few months ago, now that I've taken it recently, the dosage is much more lower, 15 milligrams, and I find that this has a lot of the positives, such as the increased concentration and increased focus, and it doesn't have so much of the negatives of methylphenidate, such as insomnia and anxiety and stuff. So what dexamphetamine actually has as its main side effects was the ones I mentioned earlier. It also produces quite strong suppression of appetite, and I found this to be much stronger than that of methylphenidate. It can also produce some in high doses, general sort of extreme talkativeness, almost hyperactivity, which is a bit ironic for an ADHD medication, and symptoms resembling mania. And when these occur, it's simply a sign that the dosage is way too high. So the actual pharmacology of dexamphetamine, it works as a norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin releasing agent in comparison to methylphenidate, which is a dopamine norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And now how these two drugs actually compare is that methylphenidate will only release it won't actually release any dopamine and norepinephrine. It only increases the concentration by inhibiting the transporter enzyme, I guess you'd call it, which pulls dopamine and norepinephrine out of the synapse. And so by blocking this enzyme, you get an increased concentration of dopamine and norepinephrine in the extracellular space. What dexamphetamine does in comparison, though, is that in addition to inhibiting this transporter, which it does in small doses, in higher doses it actually causes the transporter to work in reverse and actually release all of the dopamine and norepinephrine you have in your vesicles into extracellular space, so you get a much more rapid increase of the two substrates. And in terms of the actual how its pharmacology actually explains the differences in effects is that in low doses, at least, dexamphetamine, a person only actually perceives the effects from dopamine, which are the increased concentration and things like that, and just general sort of increased executive function. At higher doses, however, one starts feeling much stronger effects from the norepinephrine, which are things like sweating, vasoconstriction, high blood pressure and heart rate, and sort of anxiety, and so in low doses, at least, dexamphetamine actually seems to subjectively produce selective dopaminergic effects, even though it actually much strongly the drug itself actually has a much higher affinity for norepinephrine. And so basically, in order to get an equal amount of dopamine effects from dexamphetamine with methylphenidate, one has to get a lot more norepinephrine effects, if that kind of makes sense. So personally, in terms of which of the two I preferred, I find that once you get the dosage right with the dexamphetamine, it's a lot better of a drug. And there are some issues with dexamphetamine, which is, first of all, this is also an issue with methylphenidate, but it is the same amphetamine, which is commonly talked about like on TV and things, and so it can be a potentially addictive drug. Both of them have a tendency to produce cravings and a desire to sort of increase one's dose, so one has to be very careful with that. Another issue I found with dexamphetamine is that it produces much stronger withdrawals than actually the methylphenidate, and this makes sense considering because it's releasing the vesicle storage, it would upregulate the receptors at a much greater rate, so withdrawal from the substance can produce depression and hypersomnia, so one needs to be quite careful with abruptly stopping the dose. So I hope you enjoyed this quick nootropic video. In terms of its nootropic effects, which I've almost forgot to mention, is that it definitely makes one's thinking a lot more sort of, I don't know if it actually affects one's thinking, but one's articulation at least. It allows for a lot of philosophical and sort of abstract thought when, or at least in the honeymoon phase. So it can also produce the opposite effect in terms of abstract thought, where one can become quite sort of robotic, and when this occurs, it's a sign that the dosage is just way too high. So it does actually have nootropic effects in terms of especially in regards to academic performance, which is not one and the same as cognitive enhancement, but I think that dexamphetamine produces quite robust sort of academic enhancement, which is important within the context of ADHD and for some otherwise. So yeah, in terms of the future videos I'm going to do, I'll probably be doing a video on phenibut in some stage, which is a sort of sedative substance available on eBay, and in some much later stage I plan on getting the novel peptide nootropic NoPept, which is quite an interesting substance. So yeah, I'm still going to be making videos, so I hope you enjoyed this one.